Hey folks, this is Astis back again with a spell tier list video. I'm having a blast on these spell tier lists. If you haven't watched any, I recommend you check out my cantrips tier list and the two videos I made on my first level spells tier list. I had to split first level spells into two videos because there was just too many and the recording went way too long. The first level spells part 2 I found particularly fun. The chat totally blew up arguing about my ranking of the spell Longstrider. I made some memes about it because I really do find this stuff extremely fun. If you are interested in weighing in, I encourage you to, by all means, flame me. Do that in the chat of my second part of first level spells. Moving on to second level spells in this video, we got a lot to cover. I do want to make a quick disclaimer just to explain what all of the tiers mean. People in the comments of my other videos said they would prefer it if I just summarize what the tier means in each video, so we'll do that now. S tier for spells in my system is a spell that is consistently amazing, high impact, fight winning spell, and or a spell that is meta defining and worth building around. So that is S tier. A tier is for spells that are situationally amazing or consistently good. B tier is for spells which are situationally good or consistently average. C tier is for spells which are situationally average and just tend to be underwhelming spells. As a general rule, you can ignore C tier spells in your runs and you're not losing that much. Our P tier is for spells which are basically useless in combat or that just are so badly outshined by competing spells that it's not worth casting them. My tier lists are about tactics in combat, but I recognize that there are roleplay reasons why you might cast a spell, and those are completely legitimate. And so spells that don't have a combat use but might have a roleplay use, I put into my roleplay tier. Alright, enough of that. Let's dive into the rankings now, starting with the spell Aid. I am putting Aid into A tier. Let's look at it. Aid is an action to cast, but you're always casting this outside of combat, so it's pretty much free from an action economy perspective. Whenever you cast this, every ally within a radius of you is going to have their hit point maximum increased by 5 hit points, an additional 5 for each spell slot that you upcast this over second level. This lasts until your next long rest, and it is concentration free. So buffs like this are really interesting because they're action economy free, spell slot very cheap, and they're not taking your concentration. It's really, really good for that. It's also an unlimited buff, which means it's affecting every ally within the radius. And anytime you get unlimited buffs, they're going to be really good when you combine them with summon compositions, which is a style of play I really haven't had a chance to experiment with that much. I've been accused of kind of having a blind side for summon comps. I don't think so, although I'm sure I will learn more as I test it more. But yeah, definitely Aid is great for summon comps because it's just giving you so many hit points. Now, hit points are really good in Baldur's Gate 3 because of the flat math. I mean, so in 5th edition, people talk a lot about the flattened math of the design. It's just a design principle where you cannot stack bonuses too high. The scaling is very muted in 5th edition compared to other games like Pathfinder 1E or even D&D 3E. And what that means is that there's a lot of emphasis on action economy because you can't scale actions to be insanely more efficient than lower level ones. It tends to be the case that more actions win fights. That's why optimization in 5th edition and Baldur's Gate 3 tends to be about finding uses for all of your action slots. All of that is true. I've said it before as well, but what a lot of people don't talk about is the same thing holds true for hit points. Just the nature of the flattened math means hit points are extremely valuable, and just like more actions tend to win, more hit points tend to win because you can see hit points as kind of like the negative version of an action. Of course, that's an overgeneralization. I'm just telling you to get the principle across. In a game where scaling is minimized, more hit points really means a lot. And I mean, just in general, hit points are like a bottleneck. Like the buck stops here for defensive stats, where even though there's a lot of defenses like armor class and all the saving throws, it all eventually boils down to hit points. It's the most important defense, so getting a lot of it in your composition, extremely good. So yeah, that's Aid. I could put it in low S tier, but I find that small buffs applied to a lot of targets like this, I tend not to put them in S tier. I really like S tier to be, you know, highly impactful tactical choices, like the right spell at the right moment that wins you the fight. I like that to be S tier, not kind of no-brainer decisions about boosting in a small amount your stats for a lot of targets. So yeah, everyone that was seething with my long starter take is going to hate that I say that, but I think I'm being consistent here, putting Aid into A. Next up is Arcane Lock. Arcane Lock, oh, this one's so hard to rank. I could legitimately see this being at least A tier. I mean, at most A tier. I could also just see it being RP tier. I think I'm going to put it into B tier. Maybe that's a cop-out. I don't know. It's just so hard to rank this spell. Let's take a look at it. All right, so here we are, Arcane Lock. You can cast this spell on a door or a container, and it locks it. That door or container can no longer be open for the duration of the spell, which is 10 turns. It is concentration free, and it takes an action to cast. So what possible combat use could there be for locking a door or a container? Well, there's basically just one. If you are in a fight that has a doorway, like a kind of bottleneck doorway, you can kite back through it, draw enemies into it, and then lock the door, splitting the enemy's forces. So everything on the other side of the door, you're basically canceling their turns for 10 turns because they can't target you with anything, right? They're just going to move around. Splitting an enemy like that, insanely good. So I could see this being, at most, situationally amazing, right? In those niche situations where you have doorways to split enemies, it can be really, really good. I also see it being RP tier because it's just such a niche situation. I mean, are there that many fights where you can really exploit a doorway? I'm not sure. And how difficult are those fights that you really need to use this tactic? And how difficult of a tactic is this to execute on in terms of timing and controlling enemy movement? It just seems so niche to me. I've never honestly cast this in combat. I just cast it outside of combat to like build Abjuration Wizard stacks. That's how I use this mostly. So I can see an argument for it being RP tier. I don't know. I think I'm just going to put it at B tier to express this. You guys can let me know if you are using this a lot in your runs in the comments. Next up is Barkskin. Barkskin is definitely going into RP tier. Let's look at the spell. All right, Barkskin. So this is a ally, single target ally buff. You cast this on a target, and for as long as you maintain concentration or until your next long rest, that target has their armor class set to 16. Upcasting the spell gains no additional benefit. The thing is, a 16 armor class is not good. Even at the level you get this, it's just low. And especially with Larian's race design, you can get much higher armor class than 16 on basically all of your units. And then the fact that it's taking a concentration slot until your next long rest, it's never worth a concentration slot. I just don't think there's a world where this is a good spell to cast. Maybe on a shape-shifting druid, like a wild-shaping druid, you can get a better armor class in like Bear or something, but 16 is just so negligible, guys. I don't even think that's worth it. You're better off casting a different concentration spell. So it's RP tier for Barkskin. Moving on to Blindness now. I'm going to put Blindness into A tier. Let's look at it. Blindness was my favorite spell from the original Baldur's Gate game. I mean, Baldur's Gate 1, if you were like a gnome illusionist, you hit a Blindness on a target, it was fight deciding, insanely good. And in Baldur's Gate 3, it's also still pretty good, and it functions very similarly. So this is a single target debuff. You cast this on a target, and they make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail their saving throw, they are blinded for 10 turns, with no ability to re-roll. So this is a very sticky condition, 10 turns if they fail their saving throw. Blinded is a pretty good condition. A blinded target has disadvantage on their attacks, and all attacks against them have advantage. So especially on attacking kind of frontline units, you are both mitigating their damage dealt and greatly increasing your damage dealt to them. Hitting this on the right target can definitely move a fight from likely to lose to likely to win. Still, I would probably put this B tier, except for 2 new things which have been added on full release. First off, whenever you upcast the spell, you get to target an additional target, which is very, very good scaling. This scales insanely well with upcasting. By late game, 6th level spell slot, you can hit, I think, 4 targets with this. Blinding 4 targets is absolutely fight deciding, insanely good. Of course, 6th level spell slots are extremely valuable, but this is also a necromancy spell. If you don't know, there's a staff you can get in late game, the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. I made a video about it a long time ago, months ago, honestly. This staff gets you a lot of free casts of necromancy spells, fully upcast as 6th level spells. Right now, I believe the staff is still bugged, so it actually gives you infinite casts of necromancy spells. But even once they fix that, it's still a lot of free casts of necromancy spells. And this is a really, really good high-scaling necromancy spell that you can start getting for free late game. So yeah, for that reason, I'm pretty comfortable putting Blindness into A tier. It just scales really well. So next up is Blur. I'm putting Blur into B tier, but I actually do cast this quite a bit for being a B tier spell. If we just look at it now, this is a self buff. For 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration, all attacks against you have disadvantage while you are blurred. All attacks against you having disadvantage makes you very, very tanky against attacks, and that's amazing. But it is taking your concentration slot, and you guys know how this works by now. Concentration slot is so competitive, only the very best spells really get to be cast with it. But I've done a lot of experimenting with the Eldritch Knight, and Blur is actually quite a good spell for the Eldritch Knight. When blurred, they are just unhittable, and it's good for them because they're already very front line if you're going a melee build, and then they don't have a lot of high-level spells that are competing for that concentration slot anyway, so it is very good on those builds. But yeah, I think high end of B tier is a pretty good spot for Blur. Next up is Branding Smite. I'm putting Branding Smite into A tier, pretty much because I would consider this situationally amazing. Let's look at it. So Branding Smite is a Smite spell. So I think this is the only Smite spell we're going to talk about at this spell level. How Smite spells work is they augment an attack. So you're going to make an attack roll, and if this attack hits, it's going to expend a bonus action and your concentration to deal an extra 2d6 radiant damage. And then also it marks the target, Branding Smite marks the target, so that they can no longer go invisible. They're prevented from turning invisible while they're marked like this. And that's what makes this situationally amazing. There's just some fights, even early game. I'm thinking against the Dwegar and the Underdark Beach, against the Hag, where they can turn invisible, and it really, really sucks when they do that. So hitting them with the Branding Smite really makes those fights go smoother. I think it's fair to say it's fight deciding. So yeah, for that reason, Branding Smite is at least situationally amazing in A tier. It also is adding 2d6 radiant damage, which is quite good. That's a added damage to your attack. That's awesome. Radiant damage is a very good damage type because you can use it with the Radiating Orb equipment to debuff your enemies a lot. If you have passive Radiant damage on your attack, you're a Paladin that's using Branding Smite, and then you also Divine Smite on that attack, that is 3 individual instances of Radiant damage, which will stack 6 stacks of Radiating Orb on a target in a single attack. Amazing. Next up is Cloud of Daggers. Cloud of Daggers is probably, it was in my top 5 spells in early access, like my top 5 favorite spells. And I am going to keep Cloud of Daggers in S tier. Let's look at what this spell does. So here we are, Cloud of Daggers. This is a AoE cloud effect with a pretty small AoE. So whenever you cast this, it's going to create a 2 meter or 7 foot radius circle of whirling daggers. All enemies that enter this area or start their turn in the area are going to take 4d4 slashing damage with no saving throw to resist, no attack roll to hit. It's just a guaranteed proc of 4d4 slashing damage. Also, the nature of the spell, that because it procs whenever enemies enter the area, which means when you first cast it as well, and when enemies start their turn there, enemies that you cast this on are going to get a guaranteed 2 procs of damage of this, right? When you initially cast it or when you initially shove them in, and then whenever they start their turn in it. So 2 procs of this is 8d4 slashing damage, which is really good. You're never halving this because they make their saving throw either. It's like Magic Missile, it's guaranteed damage. Finally, when you upcast this, for each level you upcast it, it's adding 2d4 slashing damage. Remember, you're guaranteed 2 procs in everything you cast this on, so every level upcast is more like 4d4 slashing damage added. Insane. Insane scaling. Scaling on this is amazing. The damage is guaranteed. The only weakness this spell has is there are targets that are resistant to non-magical slashing damage, and my understanding is that it's non-magical slashing damage. Or even if you're just resistant to magical slashing damage, right? It's hard to fight those resistances against slashing. It's not like piercing damage, which you can find ways of forcing vulnerability on them. Yeah, so that is a weakness of the spell. Still, the damage is insanely good. It being this good enables what I like to call dagger ball compositions. Dagger ball because, you're summoning like a little hoop of these daggers, right, in the circle AoE, and then you just throw enemies into that hoop like they're basketballs for 2 procs for each enemy you shove into it. It's actually very, very strong. I mean, this spell's just really good. It's one of the best AoE damage spells in the game. Yeah, I think easily S. Consistently amazing, and I think also worth building around. You can build a whole composition around this, and it performs quite well. So yeah, S tier for Cloud of Daggers. Next up is Crown of Madness. It's going into RP tier. Let's look at it. Here we are, Crown of Madness. This is an action to cast. It is a single target debuff. The target that you cast this on must make a Wisdom saving throw. If they fail the saving throw, they get the Crown of Madness condition. And while they are affected by this condition, they will attack the nearest target. Sadly, this only works against humanoid enemies, right? So basically, any enemy that is of the races that you can pick in character creation, those are the humanoids. Now, making an enemy attack their allies, if their allies are close to them, is, on paper, really good, right? Because they're not just losing their action, they're spending their action helping you, right? So you can see that as taking a -1 and moving it into a +1 for actions. It's like a +2 action difference. Really, really good. The problem with this is that it only affects humanoids, and it's just really, weird to work around, right? They're going to attack the nearest target, and that might be one of you, in which case the spell is doing nothing. I mean, this was an early access, so maybe this has been fixed on full release, but it was just really buggy in the past, and maybe some of that bias is sticking with me. And just the fact that it's a Wisdom saving throw that affects humanoids means it's basically completely owned by Hold Person, which has the same restrictions, but is a much better crowd control effect. So yeah, to me, this is an RP tier just because it gets muscled out by Hold Person. I mean, for its effect, maybe into A tier, something like that. But I don't know. I'm putting it in RP tier for me. That's just my feeling about it. Next up is Darkness. Darkness is going into S tier. Let's look at it. So this is a cloud effect. When you cast this, it creates a cloud of darkness. Anyone in that cloud is heavily obscured and blinded. It lasts for as long as you maintain concentration. It has no benefits from being upcasted. Basically, this is identical to the first level spell Fog Cloud, which is really good. I covered it in my first level spell videos. And everything I said about Fog Cloud is true of Darkness. And so I'm putting them both in the S tier, although technically there's an argument for me putting Darkness into RP tier, because why wouldn't you just cast Fog Cloud, which is one spell level lower? But I'm leaving it in S tier because there are some races in the game that get Darkness that can't cast Fog Cloud, and it's actually good, right? It's just as good as Fog Cloud as a racial spell. It's like getting Fog Cloud as a racial spell, so yeah, Darkness is going into S tier. Next up, Detect Thoughts. RP tier. I don't think we even need to look at this. This allows you to detect people's thoughts. You can use it in conversation to make skill checks to gain information. It is not a combat spell in this game. I think a very cool spell from a roleplay perspective, especially because it's like a throwback to like Divinity Ego Draconis, an old game that Larian made, not quite as popular, but reading thoughts was like a big mechanic in that game. So I like the mashup of reading thoughts in a Larian game. But yeah, it's a roleplay spell. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with me on that. Next up, Enhance Ability is going into C tier. This is a very complicated spell, so let's look at it. Alright, here we are, Enhance Ability. So it's complicated because it's one of those spells that's a lot of spells in one. All of the variations of this spell, though, are a single target buff that is going to give them advantage on ability checks, that is skill checks, with a chosen ability. So for example, Constitution, Charisma, Strength, you get the idea. So for as long as you maintain concentration, or until your next long rest, they're going to get advantage on ability checks. And then some of them, I believe, the 3 physical stats are also going to give you a bonus on top of that. So we can look at those. Here's Bear's Endurance. This will give you advantage on Constitution checks, not saving throws, just checks. So this is not going to help you with your concentration saves. This will also give you 7 temporary hit points. So it's like combining advantage on Constitution skill checks with the spell False Life. So basically extremely underwhelming and guaranteed not worth your concentration. Here's Bull Strength. It's going to give you advantage on strength checks. This is one of the better ones because strength checks are necessary for throwing targets and for shoving targets, actually useful in combat. It's also going to double your weight limit. Again, who cares? Here we are, Cat's Grace. It gives you advantage on dexterity checks. That helps with stealth, so again, could be useful in combat. And then you also take half damage from falling. So underwhelming. It's not that useful. So the gist of these things is that they're useful outside of combat mostly. They technically have some in-combat use, so I can't put them into RP tier, but it's not really worth your concentration slot. I don't think anyone's going to be upset about me putting Enhance Ability into C tier. Moving on now to Enlarge Reduce. I'm putting this in B tier. I don't know, probably around here. Let's look at it. So Enlarge Reduce is a single target buff that lasts for 10 turns, or for as long as you maintain concentration. It gains no benefit from being upcast. When you cast this on a target, they are made one size larger, which means they'll go from medium size to large size. It gives them an extra 1d4 damage on their attacks, which is, not bad, especially if you have a target with extra attack or double extra attack. That's pretty good. That damage definitely adds up. And they will have advantage on their strength checks, just like the Bull Strength. So this is actually a way to get advantage on strength checks and also other things that aren't useless. So yeah, this will help with shoves and throwing enemies. And then they will gain advantage on strength saving throws, which is mostly good for resisting entangling effects. So all of these are decent, right? I think Enlarge Reduce is solidly in the situationally consistently average, because the extra 1d4 to damage is always at least average, right? You're not going to say no to that. And then it's also situationally quite good in those fights where you can get shoved into lava or off the map and stuff like that, because being made a large creature just makes you immune to being shoved in a lot of situations. And then the advantage on strength checks and saving throws also helps you resist being shoved or pushed when you can be. So yeah, in those situations, I'd say situationally good. Now, there's also an offensive use of this spell, where you can reduce a target. A reduced target gains the opposite of all of these. So they will get minus 1d4 damage to their attack rolls, I believe. They will shrink in size, and they will have disadvantage on their strength checks and saving throws. Not really that good. Maybe if you really want to shove a target that's too large to otherwise be shoved, you can do this. The problem is that it's a Constitution saving throw to resist. So, yeah, you can definitely miss, and the effect isn't that insane, right? Anyways, yeah, I think B tier is a good place for this. Hey, me from Post. I forgot to mention in my discussion of Enlarge Person that it also can increase the weight of the unit that you cast it on, which mostly isn't important unless you are using it with the Owlbear's Crushing Flight ability, I believe it's called. Owlbears get this Crushing Flight jump ability, which will deal more damage the more they weigh and also the higher that they use it from. So casting Enlarged Person with the Potion of Colossus, stacking a bunch of crates, and jumping from very high on an Owlbear is a very, very broken strategy. It deals so much damage if you have the patience for it. It can straight up one-shot bosses. I never do it myself, but I am aware that it's in the game, and it just slipped my mind whenever I was talking about Enlarged Person. So if you're using that strategy, I guess Enlarged Person is S tier for being worth building around. But yeah, otherwise I'm happy with my B tier ranking. Next up is Enthrall. Enthrall's going into C tier. Here we are, Enthrall. You cast this on an enemy, they make a Wisdom saving throw. If they fail their Wisdom saving throw, they have disadvantage. Let's look at this here. So their peripheral vision is reduced, and they will keep looking at the spellcaster. Now, I believe what that's supposed to mean is they gain disadvantage on perception checks against anyone but the spellcaster. There might also be some like taunting effects to it. Anyways, it's a concentration spell, and the effect is pretty underwhelming unless there's something I just don't understand about the spell. I haven't cast it too much because I read the description and I was like, why would I ever cast this? So yeah, if I'm missing some things, someone let me know in the comments, but I've studied a lot, I've read a lot about the way people play this game, I've talked to a lot of people. No one's ever talking about abusing Enthrall. I think you can pretty much ignore the spell, and you won't be missing much, and that's C tier. Next up is Flameblade. Flameblade, this is so painful for me. I'm putting it into B tier. It's painful because Flameblade was in my, definitely my top 5 favorite spells in early access, and I had it in S tier because I felt like it was a spell worth building around. Back in early access, it would last until your next long rest or until you maintain concentration. And you could swap it over to your offhand because it's a scimitar, it's a light weapon. And then you can combine it with the Circlet of Fire, which allowed you to get an extra bonus action whenever you dealt fire damage with a spell. And pretty much every round you can make 2 attacks with this for 6d6 fire damage just using your bonus actions. It was so good. It did take your concentration slot, and that sucks. But, you were dealing so much damage with it over a long rest period that it was really, it was something worth building around. I think that's fair to say. On full release, all of this has changed. First off, because it no longer lasts until your next long rest. It now only lasts 10 turns, but it no longer requires concentration. There is a change that kind of helps with this, where if you cast this while dual wielding, it will automatically summon it into your offhand. So that is nice. You can still use it as an offhand attack, but it's still not as incredible as an early access because the Circlet of Fire is no longer in the game. It used to be you could get the Circlet of Fire very early. The equivalent of the Circlet of Fire that's in full release is the Pyro Quickness Hat, which you don't get till the very end of the game, and the Pyro Quickness Hat is not procced with Flameblade anymore. You're not getting an extra bonus action. So this is just one bonus action attack of 3d6 fire damage. It does use your casting stat to make the attack, so charisma, intelligence, wisdom, you get the idea. It's a good way of stacking up procs of Arcane Acuity, which is really good, and Arcane Acuity will, I believe, help you with the accuracy of your Flameblade attacks. So, not terrible, not good. Yeah, I'd say consistently average, maybe getting into the consistently good range. That is Flameblade in the current state of Baldur's Gate 3. Next up is Flaming Sphere. I'm putting Flaming Sphere into the high end of A tier. So Flaming Sphere, the way it's been implemented in Baldur's Gate 3, is a summon. You summon this guy, and for 10 turns... Is it 10 turns? Yes, for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration, you have this Flaming Sphere who can take its own actions, move, make attacks, etc. So what this does as a summon is it can make this ram attack, which is actually a save attack. Enemies will make a saving throw, dexterity saving throw. If they fail, they take 2d6 fire damage, half as much on a save. It's an alright attack for the level that you get the summon in. It will also get the Ablaze, where you can toggle this, and wherever it moves will leave a fire surface behind. This will ignite things. This will ignite anything it moves over. Any enemy in that fire surface will take an additional 2d6 fire damage. So you can see how the damage on this summon can add up, and over especially a long combat, over 10 turns, you will get a lot of damage out of this cast. It's also a summon, so I believe it will draw aggro from enemies. There were some buggy things with this in early access, so I'm not as confident about how well it draws aggro in full release, but at least in theory it should draw aggro. When you upcast this, it'll add 1d6 fire damage for each spell slot above second. Not a ton of extra scaling, but the fact actually that you get so many attacks with it, that extra 1d6 for each spell slot upcast will add up. Yeah, at this level of the game, it's definitely a good summon. You're getting a lot of damage out of it, so I feel pretty comfortable putting in the high end of A tier. Next up is Gust of Wind. I am also putting Gust of Wind in A tier, probably mid to low A tier though. Gust of Wind is a lot like Thunder Wave, which we covered in the last video. This is a AoE push spell away from you. Enemies will make a strength saving throw. If they fail, they will be pushed back and be put off balance. Off balance is a new condition added by Larian. An off balance enemy has disadvantage on strength and dexterity ability checks, and attack rolls against them have advantage. So it's that second part where the attack rolls have advantage that's actually good. I believe the off balance only lasts for 1 turn. So this isn't really why you're casting this. You're casting this to push enemies. And pushing enemies is always at least situationally amazing, because if you can push multiple enemies into lava or off the map, this is a multi-target insta-kill. So yeah, always at least situationally amazing. But, I mean, other than that, there isn't really a good use for this. I consider it outshined by the Thunder Wave spell, which is even better than it, and for 1 spell slot lower. So there's a world where I put this into RP tier. But like, if you're getting this as a scroll and stuff like that, yeah, it's a good effect. Always at least A tier when you're pushing targets into lava and stuff. Next up is Heat Metal. Interesting spell. Heat Metal is going into A tier. Let's take a look at it. Here we are. This is a damage / debuff that you can cast on an enemy. So you cast this on an enemy and they make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail their saving throw, they gain the Heat Metal condition for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration. They're also going to take 2d8 fire damage. If they are holding a weapon, they will drop that weapon. So this functions like a disarm. Now, for as long as the target has the Heat Metal condition, you can spend your bonus action on your turn to recast this and deal the 2d8 fire damage again. So it's giving you kind of a persistent damage using your bonus action, which is good. However, you don't often get this because, so basically, if you cast this on a target that's holding a weapon, you will disarm them, and the Heat Metal condition actually stays on their weapon, not on them. So reigniting it doesn't deal damage to them. But it doesn't matter that much because you've disarmed them, which is incredible. Enemies that are disarmed usually won't rearm themselves, so they're going to spend the rest of the fight just slapping you for like 3 damage. Basically, you've, especially for auto attack based enemies, you've completely disabled them with this one cast of the spell. But against targets that are made of metal, casting this will actually stick on them. So like constructs and stuff like that. Yeah, it sticks on them, and you can recast this to deal quite a lot of persistent damage over time. And there's a lot of really powerful constructs in this game for you to use heat metal on. So yeah, heat metal goes into the situationally amazing tier for sure, but it's actually two situations. Any situation where you can disarm an enemy, amazing. Any situation, again, where you're fighting against constructs, amazing. So definitely in the high end of A tier. I might even put in the first part of A tier. If people feel like it should be in the S tier because of this like dual situationally amazing position that it's in, I think that is a fair take. For me though, I'm putting it high end of A tier. Next up is Hold Person. Hold Person is also going into the high end of A tier. So here we are, Hold Person. This is a spell that is like Crown of Madness, that it can only affect humanoids. You target a single humanoid target and they will make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail their wisdom saving throw, they become paralyzed for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration, or if they re-roll their save. So at the end of each of the subsequent turns that they have this condition, they get to make another saving throw to try to re-resist it, and so they can break the spell that way. What makes the spell so good is that it's a paralyze effect. Attacks in melee range against a paralyzed enemy automatically hit and automatically crit. Basically, this is a death sentence. If you hit this on a target, you're going to spend all of your subsequent actions on all of your units focusing down this target and killing them before they have a chance to break the save. It's just such a good effect. By the way, when you upcast this at later levels, you can affect additional targets. I would love to put it in the S tier. The problem is it's technically quite situational because it only affects humanoids. Now, there's lots of humanoids to fight for sure, but still, some of the most difficult fights in the game, the bosses aren't humanoids, and so yeah, I feel like it kind of gets demoted for that reason from the S tier that had it in early access. Still one of the best spells at this level for sure. Insanely good. This is kind of the reason why Crown of Madness goes into RP tier, right? Because they're basically the same spell, except this one's better. Next up is Invisibility. I'm putting Invisibility into B tier. Here we are. You cast this, and for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration, the ally that you cast it on is invisible. When you're invisible, targets can't see you, right? So it allows you to sneak around places, which is great. And you will have advantage on your attacks they make while invisible. However, whenever you make an attack and deal damage to an enemy, invisibility ends automatically. So you're only getting that advantage on one attack roll. The best use of invisibility is to position before a fight and to start that fight with surprise, and it's quite good for that. But there's other ways to do that, so I end up really not using invisibility that much, unless I'm a Duergar who just get this as like a cantrip, which is just insanely overpowered. Yeah, honestly, the fact that Duergar get this as a cantrip almost demotes it in my mind, because like if you're wanting strategies around invisibility, you might as well just play as a Duergar, right? But yeah, I'd say it's consistently average. That's where I would put it right now, because I mean, technically getting the surprise rounds as an average is good, but you can get surprise rounds without casting invisibility. Next up is Knock. I'm putting Knock into RP tier. Here it is. This is an action to cast. You cast it on a door or chest that is locked, and it will become unlocked. Basically, this is a way to bypass a sleight of hand check to unlock the door. I can think of one door in the game that is sufficiently high DC where I'd actually consider it worth casting Knock on, but you're not even really getting a combat bonus for that. I mean, basically, if you want to unlock doors, just use lockpicks and sleight of hand. There's plenty in the game. You don't need to cast the spell ever. Next up is Lesser Restoration. I'm putting Lesser Restoration into B tier. Here we are. Whenever you cast this spell, you cast this on an ally, and it's like touch range, if I'm remembering right. If that ally has the disease, poison, paralyzed, or blinded condition, this will automatically remove that condition. This is extremely good for paralyze, right? Removing paralyze is very, very important. I would say it's situationally good for that. The problem is that it's a very reactive spell. I prefer to use proactive strategies to avoid being paralyzed rather than tanking the paralyzed and trying to eat it with a lesser restoration. The reactiveness of it is kind of what demotes it a tier. It probably could belong in A tier because it is situationally amazing, but I feel like if you have good tactics, you can mostly avoid ever being paralyzed just by bursting down targets that would paralyze you, or just building around having good saving throws for it. Those are the strategies I prefer over it. But yeah, it's a good spell it's an amazing spell in those situations. Anyways, I'm putting it into B tier. I don't know, maybe around here. Next up is Magic Weapon. I'm putting Magic Weapon into C tier. So this is a concentration spell that you cast on a weapon for as long as you maintain concentration or until your next long rest. That weapon will be counted as magical and will receive a +1 bonus to attack and damage rolls. Pretty low level effect for such an expensive action economy cost, which is your concentration slot. Yeah, you can pretty much ignore this. It's not really worth it. There's much better ways to actually get the enchant weapon effect through the Drake Throat Glaive, which I covered in my Best Weapons of Act 2 video. If you don't know about the Drake Throat Glaive trick, I recommend you watch that video. I'm putting Melf's Acid Arrow into B tier. I don't know, maybe around here. So Melf's Acid Arrow is another one of these spells like Magic Missile that's pretty much been unchanged in every edition of D&D that I've played, at least as far as I remember. This is a single target attack spell. So you're going to make an attack roll against the enemy. It can crit, all of that jazz. If the spell hits, that target will take 4d4 acid damage immediately. This is the thing that can crit. Also, at the end of their next turn, they're going to take 2d4 acid damage proc. This doesn't crit, it's just a guaranteed 2d4 damage. If the spell misses, you're always going to get this extra damage. So you kind of get like a consolation prize, but it's pretty low damage for a second level spell slot. As you upcast this, you are going to gain 2d4 acid damage to the initial cast, and then an extra 1d4 to the second proc. Add it all up, it scales pretty well with upcasting, and it's a decent single target damage. Yeah, like, it's a good single target damage spell for the spell level. Actually, I might bump this up. It's good single target damage. I definitely prefer single target damage to AoE damage. Yeah, I could see a world where this goes into A tier, but I'm feeling high end of B tier for Melf's Acid Arrow. Next up is Mirror Image. Mirror Image is going into A tier. Maybe around here. Let's look at it. So this is a concentration-free personal defensive buff. When you cast this, you are going to gain 3 duplicates of you, and how Larian implements this is your armor class increases by 3 for each of those duplicate illusions. So 9 total. Whenever an attack misses you, one of those duplicates is going to disappear, which means your armor class is going to decrease by 3, right? So it starts with 9. When an attack misses you, you go down to a +6. When the next attack misses you, you go down to a +3. When the next attack misses you, you're back to your starting armor class. So this is a really good way to reliably make 3 attacks miss you. Eating up 3 attacks for the cost of 1 action is quite good. Now, it's not a guarantee that you're eating up 3 attacks, right? Because if a target critically misses you, right, so they would have missed you whether you cast a spell or not, it's still going to eat up one of those illusions. But honestly, because it's concentration free, this is one of the best ways to protect your concentration slot against attacks. And yeah, it also just makes attacks miss you. It's a very high spike of survivability for a very low amount of time, but that can be quite good. There's a lot of situations where I cast Mirror Image. It's also an illusion spell, so by late game, you can cast this on a bonus action with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. Next up is Misty Step. Misty Step is also going into A tier. I'm not sure where this is. Probably around here for me. It might be better. I don't know. It's hard to compare it to summons. It's in the high end of A tier for sure. I'm just going to put it here. Here we are for Misty Step. This spell is amazing. On a bonus action, you basically teleport. and this will break engagement, so no one's getting attacks of opportunity to attack you. It makes it really good for teleporting out of a bad spot. It's also really good for just teleporting onto melee range of a priority target on a bonus action, and you still have your full action to make attacks and kill them. I mean, I don't know what to say about this. It's just so much mobility for fairly cheap from an action economy perspective. There's so many uses of this, yeah, really quite good. I could see it being both in the consistently good to situationally amazing A tier slot. Very good spell. Next up is Moonbeam. I'm putting Moonbeam into A tier. Moonbeam calls down a silvery beam of light. It's going to deal 2d10 radiant damage into all enemies that start their turn, that move into the area, or start their turn in the area. It's not a guaranteed 2d10 though. Enemies will make a Constitution saving throw, and if they succeed, they will take half damage. This lasts, by the way, 10 turns or for as long as you maintain concentration. On your turn, you can move this. I believe you can move it as a free action. So, is it a free action? No, it's an action. I'm sorry, guys. I'm misremembering now. I'm pretty confident that it's an action to move Moonbeam. Yeah, I'm like 90% sure. But if I'm wrong about this, please let me know in the comments, and everyone can check the comments to get it certain on this. Yeah, but moving it, it's like a recast except without the spell slot use, and it's going to do the same thing of, you know, dealing 2d10 damage to the targets in that area. It's actually a pretty good way of dealing damage. Very reliable because you can move it, right? And so it's comparable to Cloud of Daggers. Oh, by the way, upcasting this adds 1d10, which is good scaling. I still prefer Cloud of Daggers, but there's an argument that it's just as good or better because you can move it, right? The damage is more guaranteed on Cloud of Daggers, but the AoE is stationary. The damage is much lower on Moonbeam, but you can move it for more consistency that way. I greatly prefer Cloud of Daggers, to be honest. And I think it's more fun to play around Cloud of Daggers because you can really build around repositioning enemies to push them back into the cloud, where this is more like a consistently good spell going into A tier. But yeah, I don't want to downplay Moonbeam. It's a good spell. Now, some people are probably thinking, wait, isn't this radiant damage? So you could be proccing a ton of radiating orbs? And yeah, that's what I thought too until I actually tested it. And for some reason, Moonbeam never actually procs radiating orb. And I don't understand why. I think it's just a bug. Hopefully they fix that. And when that's fixed, I could see this going into S tier for sure, like a spell worth building around. But yeah, since it's bugged right now, it's A tier for me. But yeah, this is the kind of spell which I would be fine with anyone putting into S tier. It's that good. Next up is Pass Without a Trace. I'm putting Pass Without a Trace into B tier. Now, all through early access, I had this into S tier, but back then, I had the entire community on my back about underestimating stealth, which is hilarious because I think I'm known for now being like a big stealth advocate. But yeah, people were always on my back, and I was kind of tired of dealing with it. But I actually think B tier is a better position for Pass Without a Trace. What it gives you is really, really interesting. Whenever you cast a spell, until you maintain concentration, you have an aura around you, and all allies in that aura gain a plus 10 bonus to their stealth checks. This plus a few other things makes you so you're almost guaranteed passing your stealth checks. Now, there isn't a ton of use for this in combat, right? Stealth is one of the better combat skills for getting surprise rounds, for sneaking into a good position, but still, not insane for combat impact. What makes Pass Without a Trace good is when you start combining this with improved invisibility. And at that point, it starts becoming a really high impact spell. But I think that has more to do with improved invisibility than it has to do with Pass Without a Trace for me, right? So I'll probably make improved invisibility S tier, but I'm going to keep Pass Without a Trace B tier. Next up, Phantasmal Force. I'm putting it into C tier. Here we are. This is a single target damage over time spell. Cast this on an enemy and they must make an intelligence saving throw. Intelligence saving throws do tend to be low on some enemies, like the Bule, for example. This is a decent spell against them. If they fail their intelligence saving throw, they will take 1d6 psychic damage at the beginning of each of their turns. However, the damage type can actually change. It always mimics the damage type of the last damage that they took. So it's weird, but you can turn this into lightning and cold damage, which potentially doubles it. Over 10 turns, it's a lot of damage, but the problem is that this isn't really a game where damage over time is actually a good strategy. It's just too slow. Everything in this game is very fast-paced. Encounters tend to be decided within 3 turns. Not ended in 3 turns, but decided in 3 turns. It's really a game about upfront burst damage, not grinded out damage over time. And for that reason, I feel like it belongs in C tier. But again, targeting intelligence saving throw is interesting. There are some enemies with low intelligence saving throws, so it could be, situationally average against them, I guess. Next up is Prayer of Healing. I'm putting Prayer of Healing into B tier for being consistently average. I'm not sure. I guess I'll just put it here. So here we are, Prayer of Healing. Whenever you cast a spell, all allies within a radius are going to be healed by 2d8 plus the spell casting modifier and hit points. You can only cast this outside of combat. For each spell level higher that you upcast it, it will add 1d8 to the healing. The healing is good, but this isn't really a combat spell, right? It's kind of like an out-of-combat recovery ability, which can be good whenever you are limiting long rests, right? Which I do. I limit my long rest to 5 per act. That's in my rule set. So yeah, there's definitely times where it's worth spending a spell slot to heal up, to push for 1 more combat, and Prayer of Healing is probably the best spell for that. But it's pretty rare. I could see this being C tier, but I'm going to put it into B tier. It's just really hard to rank spells like this, which aren't really about tactics and combat. They're actually just about recovery in between combat. They're just very reactionary spells, and I don't like casting them for that reason. Next up is Protection from Poison. B tier, I guess? Yeah, I think B tier. Let's take a look at it. So here we are. This is an interesting one. It's one of these spells like Longstrider, which gives you a boost that lasts until your next long rest and is concentration free. Unlike Longstrider, this is not a ritual spell, so you're not actually getting it for free. What it does is, the target until their next long rest has advantage on saving throws against being poisoned, and has resistance to poison damage. So it's like Dwarven Resilience, or Strongheart Resilience, the racial features. Early game poison is a very common damage type. There are 2 bosses in this game which deal a lot of poison damage. In Act 1, this spell is good for those fights. After that, I can't think of really high damage poison encounters. Poison's always just kind of around. It's a very common damage type, but in very big numbers where you want to have resistance to it, it's really just those 2 fights in Act 1. So I'd say this is situationally good. The fact that it's basically free from an action economy perspective is what keeps this out of C tier for me. Next up, Ray of Enfeeblement. Interesting spell, actually. I'm going to put this into B tier, maybe around here. So, Ray of Enfeeblement is a single target debuff spell. You cast this on an enemy. And how does this work? There's no saving throw for it. Is it an attack roll? I can't remember. I think it might be an attack roll. Someone can let me know in the comments. Either way, it's pretty easy to hit from my experience. When you hit this on a target, they will deal half damage with any weapon attack that uses strength, right? So it's reducing their damage. It's a whole new vector of reducing enemy damage, which can be very important, especially on any build which is about reducing damage, right? So if you're doing a retaliation solo kind of build, right? The spell is so good. But on none of my tier lists are for soloing. In a standard run where you have lots of targets, it's like, I would say it's situationally good. Basically, if there are enemies which deal a lot of strength damage, hitting this on them, really good, right? So it's kind of like Blindness in that way. But it's worse than Blindness because it's not really scaling with being upcast. And yeah, that's the big problem. It is a necromancy spell, but yeah, honestly, it functions a lot like a worse version of Blindness for me. But with that added kind of effect of being really good in retaliation comps, that's what keeps it out of our P tier. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about it. I think, yeah, B tier for this one. Situationally good. Next up is Ray of Fire. Ray of Fire is going into S tier, finally. It's been so long since we've had an S tier spell to talk about for this video. Let's look at it. Sorry, I've been saying Ray of Fire. It's actually Scorching Ray. I don't know how that got confused in my mind. So Scorching Ray, very cool. This is an attack spell that functions a lot like Eldritch Blast. It's going to hurl rays of fire. As a second level spell, it will hurl 3 rays of fire. Each of them is its own attack roll and procs its own on-hit effects, and will deal, as its base, 2d6 fire damage. As you upcast this, it will add an additional ray for each spell level upcast after second. So just like all spells that add additional rays when upcast, as they scale, it is actually a really good attack strategy when you start stacking on-hit effects to it. There's several ways to do this. There's the Evocation Wizard that we've talked about with Magic Missile. For Charisma casters, there is the Potent Robe. For sorcerers, you could go Draconic Ancestry, anything with fire, and you start adding damage on each ray for those. So yeah, it's a very good attack strategy. It functions really well for that. But then this has the added benefit of also being probably the best way to stack up a Hat of Fire Acuity. Last time I tested this, I don't think this has been changed. It will give you 2 stacks of Arcane Acuity for each ray that you hit. So this allows you to instantly, in one turn, full stack your Arcane Acuity, which is so insanely powerful. This is absolutely, in combination with the Hat of Fire Acuity, a meta-defining spell. Insanely strong. Yeah. Yeah, cast this a lot. By late game, you can cast a spell, get 7 stacks of Arcane Acuity, bonus action cast something like, Blindness, Hold Person, Hold Monster, and you're basically guaranteed CCing a ton of enemies. So powerful. Yeah, Scorching Ray. Honestly, it belongs in probably the best spell for this level. Maybe, I'm not sure. Definitely high end of S tier for Scorching Ray. Next up is Shatter. Shatter is going into B tier, probably around here. Maybe lower. Yeah, around here. Here we are, Shatter. So this is like, Babby's first Fireball. It's just a burst AoE damage spell. So in a small AoE, I believe it's 10 feet, 3 meters, 10 feet radius. There's going to be a burst of sound. Enemies in that area must make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail, they will take 3d8 thunder damage. If they succeed, they'll take half as much. It scales 1d8 thunder damage to the damage for each spell slot above second that you cast it. I mean, you're basically never upcasting this because in the next spell level, you get Fireball, which is just the objectively better AoE damage spell. Frankly, even at this level, you get Cloud of Daggers, which is an objectively better AoE damage spell. Yeah, it's just a mediocre AoE damage spell. I don't know what else to say about this. I could see a world where it's RP tier because, it can compete with Fireball, Moonbeam, Cloud of Daggers, etc. But technically, of those spells, this is the only one that can stack Reverberation. And so I see that being a use for it. It's the earliest way to AoE stack reverberation on targets, and it can be good for that, so I'm putting it in B tier. Next up is Silence. Silence is going into A tier, maybe around here, maybe here, actually. Let's look at it. So here we are. This creates a soundproof sphere of a pretty generous radius. 6 meters or 20 feet radius. All targets, including your allies and you, that are within that radius are silenced. A silenced target cannot cast spells. Yeah, they can't cast spells with a verbal component, which is pretty much all spells. I think maybe like Ice Knife, I think you can cast while silenced, and that's the only one that I know of. So this shuts down casters in the area. Also, you are immune to thunder damage. Yeah, so situationally you can use this to make yourself immune against a incoming thunder damage attack. Mostly it's just about silencing enemies, and it functions very similar to Fog Cloud, where there's no save to resist this. The problem is that enemies can just walk out of it. So this is quite good in combination with keeping enemies disabled in it. The thing is that enemy spellcasters, I find, it's just better to burst them down. You can pretty reliably do that in this game. Also, if you really want the silence effect, you can get it on certain weapons, the Susur weapons. So, yeah, that's why... I mean, it's also a second level spell slot, and that's why I'm not really feeling putting it in S tier like I did for Fog Cloud. I think A tier is a pretty good slot for this, but the fact that it is a good CC condition without a save to resist, that is good, so never overlook spells like this. Next up is Spike Growth. Spike Growth is going into S tier, probably around here. It's kind of similar to Cloud of Daggers for me, but I think there's probably more opportunity to build around Spike Growth, so I'm going to move it up here. But yeah, let's look at it. So Spike Growth summons spikes as a ground effect in a very generous radius. What is the radius here? Yeah, 6 meters, 20 feet, so same as Silence, which we just talked about. Enemies that move through that area take 2d4 piercing damage for every unit of movement that they move through it. If they move enough, it really adds up. I mean, especially early game, like goblins in the goblin camp will just straight up suicide running into you on the spell. And in general, it just works with forced movement. If you can push enemies around in it, they will take piercing damage as you push them, which makes for this like really weird damage strategy where you're actually just like pushing enemies around and just cheese gratering them in Spike Growth. Now, I don't love it as a damage strategy, but it definitely functions as a reliable, you can build around this meta-defining damage strategy, so definitely belongs in S tier for me. There's some really, really meme builds where you can combine the jump ability on the Hammerhaft weapon with the automatic push that you get from Tempest Cleric to start infinite jumping people to push them into Spike Growth to get just like insane damage in a single turn. Those are the kind of super niche, like kind of cheese builds which I try to leave out of my rankings. But even without builds like that, this is a spell that you can build around. It belongs in S tier for sure. Phenomenal spell. You can build an entire composition around it. Next up is Sacred Weapon. I'm putting Sacred Weapon into A tier. Let's look at it. Sorry, I said Sacred Weapon. That's something else. This is Spiritual Weapon. So this is a summon. It functions a little differently than how it works in Tabletop, where this is actually a summon. Enemies can target it. It has its own actions. You get the idea. The damage stays the same, though. It will deal 1d8 force damage on each of its attacks. It's a bonus action to summon, concentration free, that lasts 10 turns. Yes, it lasts 10 turns. The weapon that you summoned is immune to psychic damage and poison damage and resistance to all other damage types, so it actually is quite tanky. One of the tankier summons for sure. Basically, this is a way to just get kind of mediocre, a tanky but mediocre damaging summon. However, there is some variation depending on which weapon you picked, right? So this is summoning a weapon. and each one is going to get a weapon ability, right? So the Greatsword gets Lacerate. Most of them get Lacerate. Halberd gets Lacerate. Maul gets Concussive Smash. Great Axe is Lacerate. Spear and Trident, I believe, is like the Gouging Strike. A Piercing Strike, pardon me, which will give Gaping Wounds condition, which is probably the most interesting condition to build around. This is giving you damage on hit, which you can stack with Eldritch Blasts, with Scorching Rays. You guys know the gist of that one. I also really like Maul. Where was it? I also really like Maul for Concussive Smash to get Daze. That gives disadvantage on Wisdom saving throws. Very, very good for that. Honestly, all of these weapon actions are at least good, right? Like, the bleed on Lacerate is also good. So yeah, it's a good way to get one of those weapon attacks and just get an all-around tanky with moderate damage summon. It's a good summon, I feel like. Good summons belong in A tier. I did the same thing with Flaming Sphere, right? The truly great summons are going to go into S tier, but the good ones are in A tier for me. Next up is Warding Bond. Warding Bond is going into S tier for sure. It's hard to say where this goes. I'm going to put it here with the restriction of no camp casting. If you allow camp casting, this goes into probably the best spell of this level. But in the no camp casting, it's still in S tier. Let's look at it. So here we are, Warding Bond. This is a single target ally buff that lasts until your next long rest and is concentration free. The ally that you cast this on is resistant to all damage. They gain a +1 bonus to their armor class and to their saving throws. Also, each time the target takes damage, the spellcaster will take the same amount of damage. Now, this is really strange, but what happens is, if a target that has Warding Bond cast on them takes damage, you're going to apply all of the damage mitigations that you have. So your resistance to damage that you gain from the spell, that applies. If you have any other damage mitigations, those apply. So, for example, the damage mitigation that you get from adamantine armor applies. The damage mitigation that you could get from the Abjuration Wizard, that applies. All of those apply, and then whatever is left, that damage gets also dealt to the caster of Warding Bond. So in theory, it's splitting your damage in half and then applying it to 2 targets for the same amount of damage in total. However, if you stack up a lot of the flat damage reduction on top of the resistances, you can actually bring the damage down to 0 and basically no one takes any damage at all. In those situations, very, very good, but it's harder than it sounds because the AI does function pretty well against damage mitigation. They'll just target somebody else. Still, though, the defensive bonuses that it's getting you are absolutely insane. The Malice is also pretty debilitating, though, because even low amounts of damage that you take, you're rolling concentration saves on all of that damage, right? So, but even if you're making that save 95% of the time, you know, there's still that 5% that you're going to drop concentration, and that sucks. But if you build a tanky caster for the spell with really, really, really good concentration saves, Warding Bond starts becoming amazing. You can also cast this on multiple targets. Yeah, just so good. Yeah, there's a ton of strategies you can do around Warding Bond, and one of them is what I call camp casting, and this is a good time to address it. Camp casting is where you get a companion that stays in your camp, and you get them to cast all of the until your next long rest spells like Longstrider, spells like Protection from Poison, spells like Warding Bond. They cast all of those on every member. And if you do this with Gale, I don't know if they fixed this yet, but in the past, and I still think it's still the same as of releasing this video, Gale will heal up when he's in camp. He'll automatically heal up. So if Gale casts Warding Bond on all of your allies, he never dies if you keep him in camp. So now you've gotten basically a free resistance to damage on all of your party members, a free +1 armor class on all of your party members, and a free +1 to your saving throws on all members. That's so broken, it belongs in S tier, but it's also so broken I ban it. Basically, I ban camp casting for myself. I find it kind of cheesy. I think it makes the game too easy. But it's definitely a strategy in the game. You can do it if you'd like. With camp casting, Warding Bond belongs in one of the best spells in the game. But yeah, without camp casting, it's still good. I think it deserves S tier for sure. And that brings us to Web. Actually, there's 2 more spells to cover. Web and Calm Emotions. For some reason, Calm Emotions, it didn't go in alphabetical order for this one. And then these are just duplicates. We've already covered these, but for some reason, 2 icons popped up when I imported it. And I don't know how to fix that. Okay, Web. Let's look at Web. Here we are, Web. So Web is an AoE crowd control effect. It's like a ground effect that will enweb creatures in the area. Basically, this is identical to Entangle, which I covered in the first level spell tier list, except I think the radius is better. Yes, so this is a 4 meter, 13-foot radius. And other than that, Web is identical to Entangle. Man, honestly, I feel like this, I'm putting this in the C tier. I just don't think it's good. Like, I'm not even that impressed with Entangle, and this is like a only slightly better version of Entangled, but for 1 spell level higher. Yeah, I don't know. Technically, you can do the Baldur's Gate 1 strategy, where there's a pair of boots you can get that make you immune to the enweb condition, so you can cast Web, and then run a melee striker in there to attack everybody who's enwebbed. But it's just not as good in this game as it is in Baldur's Gate 1, because enwebbed isn't as good. And yeah, there's just other good strategies. I don't know what else to say. So last up is Calm Emotions. I'm putting Calm Emotions into RP tier. Let's look at it. So here we are, Calm Emotions. This is a single target spell you can cast either on an ally or an enemy. When you cast it on an enemy, they will make a charisma saving throw to resist. Targets that fail their saving throw, or if you cast it on allies, you'll gain the Calmed effect, which lasts 10 turns. While you are calmed, you are immune to being charmed, frightened, or enraged. Charmed is negligible. We do not care about this, so there's really no reason to try to make our allies immune to charmed. Frightened can be quite debilitating, but there are better ways to make a ally immune to frightened. For example, heroism. Much better way to make an ally immune to frightened. So the only real niche use of the spell is to try to make an enemy that could rage be unable to rage, which is already so niche. By the way, this is only working on humanoids as well. So it's like an even worse version of Crown of Madness. And Crown of Madness is already an RP tier because it's an even worse version of Hold Person. Hold Person just dominates both of these spells. I don't see a world where you ever want to cast either of them. So this is our list, guys. Maybe a little top heavy, but yeah, overall I'm okay with this. It's making a decent bell curve for me. And yeah, ultimately it's just where the spells land. Now let me just look at aid here, because I know there's someone in my comments that's going to be upset with where I've placed aid. Do I want this higher? I guess I'll move it to right here. Yeah, mid A tier. So yeah, here's my spell list, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love to hear your thoughts, even if you're going to flame me. I still think that's really fun. So yeah, let me know what you guys think, and we can fight about it. Anyways, that's it for this video. I will catch you next time.